New section. So here we are. This is sorry, I should have started that in a different way. But this is part two. My that was created by me. It's not part. It's not doesn't actually say part two in the actual chapter. I'm just arbitrarily cutting it off here because it's roughly the halfway point in the chapter from Tony Cliff's The Nature of Stalinist Russia, titled Russian Economy and Capitalist Crisis. It's chapter 8 of The Nature of Stalinist Russia. Um, uh, yeah, so this is part 2. There's another video on the channel for the first part. The last section was about was a section titled the Hayek-Tugan quote solution can be realized for a certain time under state capitalism. The section that we're starting with here is Bukharin on the crisis in state capitalism. The sections that follow will include: will the development of production in a state capitalist economy receive a cyclical form? How will state capitalism try to overcome the stagnation? Production and consumption of means of destruction, the perspectives of the Russian economy, and the social character of the regime. So here we go. In his polemical book on Rosa Luxemburg's, so here we are, Bukharin on the crisis in state capitalism. In his polemical book on Rosa Luxemburg's theory of accumulation, Der Imperialismus und die Accumulation des Kapitals, Bukharin poses, among other problems, the question of the process of reproduction on an enlarged scale, and discusses whether a crisis of overproduction would take place in it. He defines state capitalism in these words, quote, the capitalist class united in one united trust, an organized economy, but one which is at the same time, from the standpoint of the classes, antagonistic, end quote. Bukharin continues, quote, is accumulation possible here? Naturally, the constant capital grows since the consumption of the capitalist grows. The constant capital grows since the consumption of the capitalist grows. Bracket, my emphasis, end bracket, so Cliff's emphasis. New branches of production corresponding to new needs are always established. The consumption of the workers, although definite limits are placed upon it, grows. Despite this, quote, underconsumption of the masses, no crisis arises, as the demand of the various branches of production for each other's products, as well as the demand of the consumers, capitalists as well as workers, is fixed in advance. Despite this, quote, underconsumption of the masses, no crisis arises, as the demand of the various branches of production for each other's products, as well as the demand of the consumers, capitalists as well as workers, is fixed in advance. Instead of, quote, anarchy of production, what is, from the standpoint of capital, a rational plan? The consumption of the capitalist is the motive power for production and for the production plan. The consumption of the capitalist is the motive power for production and for the production plan. Bracket, my emphasis, Cliff's emphasis, end bracket. Consequently, there is in this case not a specially rapid development of production, parenthesis, there is a small number of capitalists, end parenthesis, end quote, Bukharin. Footnote, it is interesting to note that Marx already connected stagnation or dormancy with the decrease in the number of capitalists to a mere handful in the whole world. Marx writes, quote, the rate of profit, that is, the relative increment of capital, is above all important for all new offshoots of capitalism seeking an independent location, and as soon as the formation of capital were to fall into the hands of a few established great capitals, which are compensated by the mass of profits for the loss through a fall in the rate of profits, the vital fire of production would be extinguished. It would fall into a dormant state, end quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 3, page 304. End footnote. The words, quote, in this case, not a specially a specially rapid development of production, end quote, are liable to mislead. Production not only will be, quote, not especially rapid, end quote, but will be very slowed down compared with the productive capacity of capitalist economy. There will be stagnation. At first glance, it might seem Bukharin's description of the relation between state capitalism and the crisis of overproduction is to be the absolute opposite of the Tugin-Hayek quote solution. Whereas Tugin and Hayek speak about capitalism in which there is a very rapid rise of production and accumulation, Bukharin speaks of a system in which production and accumulation are very slow. While Tugin and Hayek speak about accumulation increasing what the hell? I don't know if this is a typo. It says emtorally. Is that a word or is that just a typo? Yeah, I think it's a typo. I think it's supposed to be entirely. Increasing entirely independent of consumption. Bukharin speaks about accumulation as a dependent, an accompaniment of consumption. But notwithstanding the antagonism between Tugin, Hayek, and Bukharin, they are connected with each other and both point to the fundamental contradiction which exists in capitalism between accumulation and consumption. The former points to the possibility of overcoming this contradiction by fully liberating accumulation and production from consumption. The latter points to the possibility of overcoming it by slowing down accumulation and production in accordance with consumption. The former says that production for accumulation's sake alone, the latter that quick accumulation is impossible and production will therefore slow down. The former reflects the boom phase of the capitalist cycle in which accumulation far surpasses consumption, the latter the phase of crisis in which accumulation falls far below consumption. In both, the worker remains oppressed by capital. The Tugin-Hayek quote solution is possible for state capitalism in a backward country. Bukharin's description fits to state capitalism which reaches the saturation point of means of production. I'm guessing there's a typo in here. A lot of typos in this entry. Footnote, of course, in all probability, long before Stalinist Russia could reach this stage, the proletarian revolution would have been victorious in Russia and the world. End footnote. The latter is capitalism apparently freed of crisis, but in reality in permanent crisis, a crisis which expresses itself in productions not rising above the demand, is fundamentally the same as stagnation in which production is restricted to the demand. Both express the conflict between the productive forces and the capitalist relations of production and distribution. When the Tugin-Hayek process ends and the Bukharinist period begins, will unemployment appear? It will not. Under individual capitalism, the change in the relative size of the reserve army regulates the level of wages. With the decline of the rate of profit, the economy reacts automatically by throwing workers out of industry and increasing the reserve army, which, after a shorter or longer period, brings about a decline in wages and the restoration of the rate of profit, encouraging capitalist production from anew. Under state capitalism, this automatism is replaced by the administrative action of the employer state, which achieves the same objective result of cutting costs of production, necessary in the state capitalist country to encourage production in the interest of its competition on an international scale, in a different way. In a crisis under individual capitalism, let us say 20% of the workers are thrown out of employment, and the standard of living of the masses, those who receive wages as well as the unemployed who receive relief, falls by 50%. State capitalism can achieve exactly the same results in the level of production and cost of production by keeping full employment. God, this fucking sucks. But cutting wages by 50% and cutting the time every worker works by 20%. In addition to what the workers suffer through their wages being cut, This would mean further hardships for the workers, as they would be shifted from one industry to another, would have to migrate from one place to another, etc. New section, Section 10. Will the development of production in a state capitalist economy receive a cyclical form? We have explained that the material basis for the oscillatory movement of economy is the life and death of fixed capital. As in Russia, the renewal of the fixed capital does not take the form of a one-time expansion and then stoppage. The anarchy in the renewal of fixed capital, that is, the anarchy in accumulation, is not a factor making for an oscillatory movement. We have seen that the decline of the rate of profit has two aspects. The one, the continuous slow decline of the rate of profit as a result of the rise of the organic composition of capital. The other, the swift decline of the rate of profit as a result of changes in the wage level. The latter alone constitutes a cause of the oscillatory movement. Because of the total suppression of the workers by the state in Russia, this factor does not affect it. The only factor which does affect it is the general decline of the rate of profit, consequent upon the continuous rise in the organic composition of capital. This does not drive Russian economy towards an oscillatory movement, but towards eventual stagnation, which in the present Tugendhat stage is overcome, as we have explained, by the production of machinery, in order to produce machinery, and so on. As credit does not push production in Russia beyond the point where it would have stopped had all payments been made in cash, the money market is not a cause of the cyclical movement of the economy. John Strachey, describes the movement of the economy under creditless capitalism, quote, "If we can imagine a creditless capitalism in which every transaction was mediated by hard cash, then it is true that the oscillatory form of the crisis, but not the crisis itself, might be abolished. We should get a slow, steady decline of the rate of profit, which would act upon the system like a creeping paralysis," end quote. John Strachey. Footnote. The difference between a crisis which expresses itself cyclically or in a creeping paralysis continuing for decades is not fundamental from the standpoint of the Marxian theory of crisis. Let us remember how Bernstein was refuted when Bernstein sought in 1898 to prove that Germany's freedom from crisis for the past 25 years proved the bankruptcy of the Marxist theory of crisis. Rosa Luxemburg in Sozialreform oder Revolution, Reform or Revolution, shows that the law of periodicity of the crisis, whether the period be 10 or 20 years, or even 40 or 50 years, is not essential to the Marxist theory of crisis, but is, quote, their internal mechanism and deep general causes, end quote. Rosa Luxemburg, end footnote. New section. How will state capitalism try to overcome the stagnation? Before approaching this question, let us see how capitalism has hitherto overcome crisis. On this, the Communist Manifesto says, quote, "And how does the bourgeoisie get over these crises? On the one hand, by enforced destruction of a mass of productive forces, on the other by the conquest of new markets, and by the more thorough exploitation of the old markets, that is to say, by paving the way for more extensive and more destructive crises, and by diminishing the means whereby crises are prevented." End quote. Marx, the Communist, and Engels, the Communist Manifesto. The same idea Marx expressed in Wage, Labor, and Capital thus, quote, "In the measure that the capitalists are compelled, to exploit the already existing gigantic means of production on a larger scale, and to set in motion all the mainsprings of credit to the end, to the same measure do the industrial earthquakes increase, in which the trading world can only maintain itself by sacrificing a part of wealth, products, and even of productive forces, to the gods of the underworld. In a word, crises increase. They become more frequent and more violent, if only because in the same measure in which the mass of production, and consequently the needs for extended markets, grows, the world market becomes more and more contracted. Fewer and fewer new markets remain available for exploitation. Since every preceding crisis is subjected to world trade, a market hitherto unconquered or only superficially exploited. End quote. Marx, Wage, Labor, and Capital. Thus, the bourgeoisie overcomes crisis not by the destruction, including the important factor of devaluation, of many of the productive forces, but also by the conquest of new markets. The importance of these conquests for the overcoming of crises was expressed most lucidly by Marx in the chapter on Crisis and Capital. Quote, "This is a law of capitalist production imposed by incessant revolutions in the methods of production themselves. The resulting depreciation of existing capital, the general competitive struggle, and the necessity of improving the product and expanding the scale of production, for the sake of self-preservation and on penalty of failure. The market must therefore be continually extended, so that the market's interrelations and the conditions regulating them assume more and more the form of a natural law, independent of the producers, and become ever more uncontrollable. This internal contradiction seeks to balance itself by an expansion of the outlying fields of production, but to the extent that the productive power develops, it finds itself at variance with the narrow basis on which the conditions of consumption rest." End quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 3, page 286 to 287. End footnote. State capitalism, on coming to the crisis of overproduction, will be faced with much deeper contradictions than individual capitalism, and at the same time the means of overcoming them inside the country itself will be much smaller. That the surplus of products will be immense is clear from the fact that state capitalism brings to its peak the antagonistic character of distribution, the accumulation of capital, while it depresses to the extreme the standard of living of the masses. With the abolition of individual peasant economy, with the transformation of the masses of peasants into wage earners, with the transformation of Russia as a whole into one state capitalist economy, the possibilities of overcoming the crisis with the help of internal forces alone cease to exist. To emerge from the crisis demands cutting wages, cutting the price of raw materials, devaluating fixed capital, and finding new markets. 1. As regards the cutting of wages, even if we assume that the wages in Russia are not the physical minimum, to cut wages will not overcome the crisis, but will only increase the rate of exploitation. In order, however, that the surplus value be realized, it is necessary to enlarge the markets. In the conditions of individual capitalism, where besides workers and capitalists there are millions of peasants, urban petty bourgeoisie, etc., the cutting of the wages of the industrial workers does not eliminate the possibility of finding new markets inside the country, at least as long as the capitalist economy is not developed, as long as the internal contradictions are not too deep for the pre-capitalist elements in the country to carry. In the conditions of state capitalism, the increase in the rate of exploitation in itself will not pull the economy out of the crisis. Expansion to other countries will be imperative. 2. As regards the lowering of the prices of raw materials during a crisis under conditions of individual capitalism, the price of raw materials usually drops, and through this the rate of profit in industry rises. In this way, industry puts the burden of industry's difficulties on the shoulders of the producers of raw materials, first and foremost the agriculturalists in the colonies. Not only, however, does agriculture suffer, but monopolist industry increases its rate of profit at the expense of other industries also. Under conditions of state capitalism, all the branches of the economy comprise different elements of one and the same economic enterprise, and the rate of profit cannot rise through one branch raising its prices against another. 3. As regards the devaluation of capital, in a crisis in the countries of individual capitalism, a large part of the fictitious capital is annihilated. Financial manipulations connected with this process bring about a redivision of the surplus value among a smaller number of capitalists so that the rate of profit increases. Connected with this process, and one of its expressions, is the selling of industrial enterprises to new buyers for low prices, such low prices as make the enterprises profitable concerns even in a crisis. Self-evidently, a precondition for this process is the existence of individual ownership over the means of production. State capitalism excludes it. The only means of capital devaluation possible during a crisis under state capitalism is the wear and tear of the machines which lie idle, including their, quote, moral wear and tear, i.e. obsolescence. 4. As regards the finding of new markets, as we have said, state capitalism, which has reached the stage of overproduction, cannot, during a crisis, when the building of new industry stops, find new markets of any considerable size inside the country itself. It must expand to foreign markets. In the Tugendhat stage, where Russia's monopoly of foreign trade preserves it from foreign commodities, Russia itself directs its efforts not to the production of foreign markets, but to production for its own industries. We have already seen how restricted is Russia's foreign trade, which is directed mainly towards selling products in order to buy new means of production. In 1937, for instance, means of production made up 90.9% of all the imports, while means of consumption made up only 9.1%. Footnote: the analysis in this chapter should clearly show why Trotsky's prognosis, which he repeated from 1925 onwards, that trade connections between Russia and the world would increase, was wrong. End footnote. If the end of the Tugendhat phase were to approach, Stalinist Russia, faced with the creeping paralysis Bukharin describes, which cannot be overcome internally, will be thrown onto the world market. The rise of Russia's productive capacity itself will produce certain bottlenecks as a result of the uneven tempo of development of certain industries. Even today, there is a serious bottleneck in the lag of oil output behind that of other basic industries. In order to overcome these, to take advantage of certain superior natural conditions, and to decrease the disadvantages of other natural conditions, Russia will tend to increase international exchange relations. The need to accumulate, the result of industrial and military competition, will also at this stage drive Russia to compete on the world market. There is no Chinese wall between the Tugendhat and the Bukharinist stage. Between the tendency towards national economic autarky and the expansion to the world market, there is no Chinese wall. Insofar as both transitions take place simultaneously, the picture of developed state capitalism given by Bukharin will need correction. On the background of the general stagnation of state capitalist economy, a cyclical movement will arise as a result of the cycles on the world market. Not one of the waves, however, will bring a boom which to any considerable extent ameliorates the conditions of the masses. New section, section 12. Production and consumption of means of destruction. As we have said, so long as state capitalist economy is backward, production can, in spite of antagonistic distribution of the, quote, restricted consumption of the masses, end quote, Marx, rise continuously, as means of production produce means of production to produce means of production, and so on. When the production of means of production reaches saturation point, which is a relative concept compared with other countries, then the, quote, consumption of the capitalist is the motive of production, end quote. But as the, quote, capitalist process of production is essentially a process of accumulation, end quote, Marx, Capital, Volume 3, production whose motive is consumption is clearly the negation of capitalism. This negation reveals itself in traditional capitalism in the recurring crises of overproduction, at which time accumulation ceases altogether, and there is even disaccumulation, which bears witness to the fact that the capitalist relations of production and distribution have become an impediment to the accumulation of capital. It reveals itself in state capitalism when the economy reaches the Bukharinist stage of stagnation. The accumulation of the past becomes an impediment to additional accumulation. The relations of production and distribution become an impediment to accumulation. Capital becomes the limit for the accumulation of capital. From the standpoint of the economy as a whole, what is specific about the consumption of the capitalist is the fact that the consumption of the capitalist does not constitute part of the process of reproduction. The consumption of means of production reveals itself in new means of production or consumption. The means of consumption consumed by the workers reveal themselves in the reproduction of labor power, which is a necessary element of the process of reproduction as a whole. But the products consumed by the bourgeoisie do not appear as an element in any form in the new production cycle. It is only a negative element, a subtraction from the process of reproduction. There is, however, one kind of consumption which, while it is a subtraction from the process of reproduction just as much as the personal consumption of the bourgeoisie, nevertheless constitutes a means in the hands of the bourgeoisie to get new capital, new possibilities of accumulation, to, quote, accumulate, to conquer the world of social wealth, to increase the mass of human beings exploited, end quote. This is war production. If we call the one kind the, quote, personal consumption of the capitalist, end quote, we should have to call the armaments, equipment, and stores of the soldiers the, quote, collective consumption of the capitalist class, end quote. Although both the, quote, personal consumption of the capitalist, end quote, and the, quote, collective consumption of the capitalist class, end quote, are a subtraction from the process of reproduction, there is a fundamental difference between them from the standpoint of the capitalist class and from the standpoint of humanity as a whole. Let us begin by analyzing the differences from the standpoint of the capitalist class. The employment of a certain number of workers to cater for the, quote, personal consumption of the capitalist, end quote, will have the same direct results as the employment of the same number of workers to serve the, quote, collective consumption of the capitalist class, end quote, but indirectly. The latter has invaluable advantages from the standpoint of the capitalist class. For in the event of a military victory, the wealth of the victorious capitalist state will increase at the expense of the vanquished. The production of guns, let us say in Germany, did not influence the accumulation or the rate of profit in any way other than if palaces for the bourgeoisie had been built, or even if uncompetitive products, i.e. uncompetitive with existing enterprises such as public palaces, parks, etc., had been produced which had been distributed gratis to the people. But the necessities of capitalist competition drove the German bourgeoisie to employ part of the population, not in the construction of palaces for the people, nor even for the bourgeoisie itself, but in war economy and war. Footnote. The source of financing the palaces would have been the same as the source of financing the guns. Hitler did not reach financial bankruptcy as bourgeois and reformist financiers had mistakenly prophesied since 1933. When Hitler came to power, the national debt was 40% of the annual national income, and the pre-Hitler government found it extremely difficult to bear such a debt burden. After a few years of Hitler's rule, the national debt was many times higher. But Hitler found no difficulty in paying the interest on it. The reason is that with the working of previously unused factors of production, the source of finance, the national income, increases correspondingly with war production. When the unused factors of production are brought into use by the economies going onto a war footing, the employment of a people in the production of guns does not always cause a decline in the consumption of the masses or in the accumulation of the capitalist, but may be accompanied by a rise. Thus, for instance, if 3 million or 6 million unemployed are put into the production of guns, the purchasing power distributed among them will cause the employment of, let us say, an additional 2 million in the production of means of consumption and 1 million in the production of new means of production. The employment of 3 million in the production of guns thus does not cause a decline in the volume of the capital accumulated or in the consumption of the masses, but a certain increase due to the fact that instead of 6 million unemployed producing nothing, there are now only 3 million who had nothing to the process of reproduction. The internal contradiction in capitalism causes a subtraction to appear as an addition. It was such conditions that caused the national income in Germany till 1943, and in the U.S. during the whole war, to grow more than the war expenditure. This, of course, does not abolish the fundamental antagonism between the production of guns and butter, which is clearly revealed in the destruction of factors of production in the enemy countries brought about by the process of consuming the guns. End footnote. The common factor of a war economy and a crisis of overproduction is that real accumulation is very small. If we add to this small accumulation the personal consumption of the capitalist, then subtract the wear and tear of capital, the destruction, etc. from this sum, the rate of profit will be seen to be very low or even many times negative. At the same time, one industrial enterprise increases its capital at the expense of another. Seeing that in respect of accumulation, crisis and war have fundamentally the same results, it can be assumed theoretically that in place of the boom-crisis-boom cycle will come the boom-war-boom cycle. And seeing that the tendency of declining capitalism is the lengthening and deepening of the crisis, and the shortening of the boom, which also becomes ever more superficial, we may theoretically assume that capitalism will enter a period whose characteristic feature is a cycle of wars and booms, in which the former, wars, become ever longer and more destructive, and the booms ever shorter and more superficial. The only impediment to the complete transformation of the capitalist cycle from boom-crisis-boom to boom-war-boom is the social opposition of the masses. This alone can prevent the U.S., for instance, from making even vaster preparations for a Third World War, or beginning the war itself when the post-war boom and the Marshall Plan exhaust themselves. Whereas in respect of capital accumulation, the direct result of a war economy is in essence the same as that of a crisis. In respect of the level of production, the use of productive capacity, a war economy is like a capitalist boom, and both the economy works at full blast. The boom-war-boom cycle would thus appear as the abolition of the economic cycle, as all the time there would be full employment and the economy would be working at full blast. The crisis of overproduction is at one and the same time an affirmation and negation of the capitalist mode of production. The crisis of overproduction is an affirmation because it is specific to the capitalist mode of production, and a negation because the crisis of overproduction throws into relief the impediments to this mode of production embodied in this mode of production's self. This is equally true as regards the war economy. Here we must go further. A capitalist war does not lead only to a stoppage of accumulation and a destruction of capital to a point where accumulation becomes possible from anew. It can lead to destruction of such dimensions as signify a tendency towards the absolute negation of capitalism, on condition, of course, that the proletarian revolution does not negate capitalism by barbarism. It can lead to the destruction of such dimensions as signify a tendency towards the absolute negation of capitalism, on the condition, of course, that the proletarian revolution does not negate capitalism by barbarism. The war, like the crisis, is a partial negation of capitalism, but may lead to capitalism's absolute negation. Once again, we see that when the bourgeoisie comes into the most extreme conflict with the needs of humanity, as it does when entering the war cycle out of the crisis cycle, it uses elements of a socialist society. The state, intervening ever more in the direction of the economy, uses the socialist element of planning in the interest of stabilizing its oppressive regime. In a war economy, as in a socialist economy, production goes on at full blast. But production at full blast, where the relations of distribution are antagonistic, where the large-scale accumulation of the past impedes new accumulation, is possible only if a large part of the product is not exchanged. If is not produced as values, but as use values. In a socialist economy, the aim of production is use values. In a capitalist war economy, a major part of the production, too, is the production of use values. But use values in a socialist society are those needed by the masses, while in a capitalist war economy they comprise guns, equipment and stores for soldiers, etc. Use values determined in the interest of an exploiting minority. In a socialist society, use values are the aim of production. In a capitalist war economy, use values are means, quote, to conquer the world of social wealth, to increase the mass of human beings exploited, end quote. What is common to a capitalist war economy and a socialist economy makes the capitalist war economy and a socialist economy extreme opposites. If Stalinist Russia is not overthrown by the proletarian revolution or smashed in an imperialist war, and it completes the Tugendhaik stage, the bureaucracy will then have three methods open to it to circumventing overproduction and stagnation. 1. Raising the standard of living of the masses. 2. Increasing the personal consumption of the bureaucracy. 3. Increasing the, quote, collective consumption of the bureaucracy. War production. In the light of the masses' lack of control over the means of production and the sharpening antagonisms among the different powers, we may incontrovertibly say that the tendency overshadowing everything will be the third. It is childish to ask whether Russia's development in the Tugendhaik direction, or at a later stage towards the stagnation of production or towards a war economy, is the outcome of internal forces alone. It is as childish to ask the same question regarding one individual capitalist in another country. If accumulation is necessary, it is only because of a competition between one capitalist and other capitalists. If accumulation at a certain stage comes to a standstill, but the capitalists do not build pyramids or palaces for the people, it is not because the individual capitalist gets less profit from this than by producing guns, but because the production of guns holds on its horizon the promise of control over wealth and people, and this is a necessity of competition. It has been a necessary abstraction at a certain stage of our analysis to assume that only the completion of the Tugendhaik stage would Russia be driven to a production whose motive is the consumption of the bureaucracy, and primarily their, quote, collective consumption. Now it is necessary to approach nearer to reality. The Stalinist regime, as we have said, came into being as the result of two factors: the maturity of the world for socialism and the backwardness of the Russian economy. The backwardness of Russia explains the possibility of the Tugendhaik stage. The maturity of the world in the face of the belatedness of the proletarian revolution brings the imperialist war to the foreground, which poses the necessity for Russia to undertake war production. Russia therefore produces machinery to produce machinery and so on, and at the same time must undertake war production. The war economy itself postpones the completion of the Tugendhaik stage. New section, section 13. The perspectives of Russian economy and the social character of the regime. As we know, every ruling class develops the productive forces up to a certain stage. We could hence define the class character of the regime in Russia according to the stage to which this regime can develop the productive forces. If we find that the existing regime in Russia can, if it is not overthrown, develop the productive forces to a higher stage than capitalism did, and could, it is sure proof that the ruling class in Russia is not fulfilling only the historical mission of the capitalist class. We should then have a new class to define. The unparalleled tempo of development of the economy in Russia does not in itself prove the non-capitalist character of its system. We know, for instance, that United States capitalism developed incomparably more quickly than British capitalism. What we need to know in order to characterize the regime is the limits to which the productive forces in it can develop. According to Marx, the only limit to the development of the productive forces under capitalism, the only limit to the accumulation of capital, is capital itself. Capitalist relations of production engender the conflict between production and consumption, the tendency towards the decline of the rate of profit, etc. Now, as we have shown, these same limits will restrict the development of the productive forces in Russia. After the point of saturation of the economy with means of production, which depends on the prevailing productive forces in the world, the productive forces in Russia will meet the same impediments as those in other countries. Thus, if we assume that Russia will not be conquered and destroyed by another power, it will succeed in developing its productive forces only to the same stage as world capitalism did, even though it may be the strongest power in the world. The Tugendhat, quote, solution and the Bukharinist stage are expressions of the incapacity of the regime to use production in the interest of the masses, and the regime is therefore driven either to the production of machinery, to produce machinery, and so on, or to stagnation, or to a war economy as a means, quote, to conquer the world of social wealth, to increase of the mass of humans being exploited, end quote. One may assume that all this is true only if one assumes that the antagonistic mode of distribution does not cease to exist. But to assume that the privileged rulers of Russia, who find themselves in opposition to the toilers on the one hand, and to other capitalist powers on the other, will abolish this as logical as to assume that the American capitalists will do it. The fact that the existing regime in Russia thus limits the development of the productive forces proves the capitalist character of this regime. This throws new light on another question that has already been dealt with, the relations of production and distribution in Russia. According to Trotsky, the relations of distribution prevailing in Russia are capitalist relations, while the relations of production are not. As we have remarked, the abstraction of relations of distribution from relations of production is foreign to Marxism. The analysis of this chapter has furnished a new proof of this. On the basis of the existing productive forces, an antagonistic capitalist method of distribution must have the same effect on the general development of the productive forces. We see again that the relations of distribution make up one of the important elements. We again see that the relations of distribution make up one of the important elements in the law of movement of the productive forces. They are part and parcel of the relations of production. The above analysis of the limits of the development of the productive forces in Russia also takes the ground from the beneath all those who try to define the ruling class in Russia as non-capitalist and non-proletarian. Those who say it is a bureaucratic, collectivist, managerial, etc. That it is bureaucratic, collectivist, managerial, etc. One must not understand the words, quote, limit to the development of the productive forces, end quote, mechanistically, and take them to mean that there are absolute inflexible limits. Under feudalism, the limits to the development of the productive forces were the feudal relations of production. The productive forces could not develop beyond the limits of individual production. The socialization of labor brought with it the destruction of feudalism. But although the limits of production under feudalism were the same in different countries, the level of technique, productivity of labor, and so forth reached were not exactly the same. The same applies to the limits of development on manorial or church property. And we may say that just as the feudal character of church property is proved by the identity of the limits of development on this and on manorial property the capitalist character of Russia is proved by the identity of the limits of its productive forces and those of world capitalism. That's the end of the chapter. Thank you so much for listening.